Everyone knows the story of how Darwin came to write The Origin of Species, in which he proposed his theory of evolution by natural selection. We're also all generally aware that between 1900 and 1905, Mendelian genetics was rediscovered, providing the long-sought mechanism of inheritance by which natural selection could act. What few people understand is that by 1910, very few biologists actually accepted natural selection. In fact, by the time Mendelian genetics had been broadly accepted, Darwin's mechanism seemed irrelevant to the study of evolution. After all, if inheritance is particulate, then the only way to change it was mutation. At the time, mutation was viewed as the mechanism by which organisms changed. The history behind why Darwinian selection was almost discarded by geneticists is long and convoluted, but it has to do with two competing schools of thought going into the 20th century. The biometricians, also called the Darwinists, and the Mendelians. The former followed Francis Galton's law of ancestral heredity and believed that Darwinian selection acted on continuous traits and that evolution was gradual and slow. The latter followed Mendel's laws, contending that evolution was discontinuous and could be rapid, with speciation happening in one big mutational leap. To the Mendelians, mutation was clearly the most important feature of evolution, and they followed Hugo de Vries's mutation theory instead of Darwin's natural selection theory. Hence, when the Mendelian school won the debate over inheritance, the mutation theory kind of tagged along at the expense of Darwinian selection. Today, we think of the modern synthesis as the unification of Darwinian natural selection and Mendelian inheritance. The reason these two needed to be unified is because people originally thought they were antithetical due to these heated debates between the Darwinists and the Mendelians. This unification was achieved by three key figures who were all teenagers while these debates were raging. These figures are J.B.S. Haldane, R.A. Fisher, and Sewall Wright. You've likely heard their names, but you may be unfamiliar with what exactly they did. Sure, they unified Mendelian inheritance with Darwinian selection, but how did they do that? In this video, I'm going to take a historical angle, providing the story of each of these men's lives, both personal and professional, as well as discussing how each attacked the problem from different angles. I want to stress here two things before we begin. First is that while these men were incredibly important in the development of the modern synthesis, the development of evolutionary theory didn't end with them, right? In much the same way as physics didn't stop with Newton and Leibniz. Second is that I'm glossing over some incredibly important history concerning these hostile debates in the 1900s between the Mendelians and the biometricians. So understand that the skepticism towards Darwinian selection ran deep due to its association with the biometric school. They were, after all, called Darwinists. Perhaps I'll do a follow-up video going into the acrimonious debates between these two camps. Let me know in the comments if that would be interesting to you. Anyways, let's lay just a bit of background to understand how Fisher, Haldane, and Wright would become evolution's holy trinity. Once the question of heredity had been settled in favor of Mendel's laws, researchers now knew how to set up breeding experiments because they could actually make predictions about what they should see. And it was these experimental results that first demonstrated the power of natural selection. The most striking experiments came from William Ernest Cassel, who carried out a long-term selection experiment on hooded rats. The experiment was very simple. Hooded rats have a dark hood over their head of black fur, while the rest of their coat is white. Every generation, Cassel and his group selected for rats where their hooded pattern extended ever so slightly. They were able to do this because there existed an initial variation in the lab population for the extent of the dark hood. But over time, they were able to select far beyond what original variation had been there until, after only a few generations, they had a population of entirely black rats. The experiment was incredible. It sparked heated discussion over how exactly it was carried out, how much variation existed in the trait to begin with, whether or not the rats would revert back after selection. Castle was able to answer all of these critiques as they kept representatives from each breeding population and showed that the black rats bred pure and did not revert back to the original hooded form. Darwinian selection had permanently changed them. Remember, at the time, selection was not thought to be able to act on continuous traits. Shortly after, Thomas Hunt Morgan in his lab, working with Drosophila, discovered that Mendelian traits may have very, very small effect and concluded that Mendelian variants of small effect looked no different than purely continuous variation. These discoveries marvelously explained what had so troubled geneticists and had kept the biometricians around for so long, that some traits appeared truly continuous, not discrete, as the Mendelians thought. Well, it turned out they were still discrete. They were just many discrete genes, each with small effect, what we now call polygenic. All of these experimental studies were incredibly important, but in science, experimental results are only as useful as the theoretical framework in which they're understood. Science is inductive. We're looking at specific results and trying to generalize to a broader understanding of reality. How broadly applicable were these experiments? How can we understand in a more general sense the power of selection and its relationship with Mendelian inheritance? As I stated previously, three men were central to unifying Darwinian natural selection and Mendelian genetics into a firm theoretical framework: R.A. Fisher, J.B.S. Haldane, and Sewall Wright, and they would become known as evolution's great Trinity. Each of these men made invaluable contributions both to the study of evolution as well as to other fields. R.A. Fisher, for example, is responsible for most of modern statistics. J.B.S. Haldane made considerable contributions to physiology, and Wright, in many ways, is the father of mammalian genetics. Before diving into each of these men's lives and work, let's lay out broadly their individual contributions, and then we'll return to these points a few times to really hammer them home. So J.B.S. Haldane gave us the first mathematical expressions for understanding how natural selection acts on single genes in a Mendelian framework. Fisher derived expressions for how natural selection can act on polygenic traits and connected continuous traits mathematically to Mendelian inheritance. And finally, Wright provided us with an exhaustive mathematical understanding of random genetic drift and its interaction with selection, with a particular focus on population structure, mating systems, and inbreeding. Again, we'll come back to each of these, but now let's dive into the personal and professional lives of these fascinating men, starting off with Ronald Elmer Fisher. R.A. Fisher is perhaps the most troubling of the three. His formal training was in physics, but he would become known for his extensive contributions to statistics and evolutionary theory. He suffered from a terrible stigmatism that made it difficult for him to read using bright lights, and this often led him to work out his mathematical theorems in his head. He's been criticized by many trying to interpret his work, as there seem to be extensive leaps in mathematical logic that most couldn't follow. His bad eyesight also fortuitously kept him out of World War I. Fisher was a deeply racist man who wrote extensively on the topic of eugenics and was one of only 4 dissenting members of the UNESCO's famous 1950 Race Question report. If you don't know what that is, take some time to Google it after this video. It's one of the most important developments in moving the natural sciences out of entrenched racism that had haunted it for like hundreds of years. In 1914, Fisher published a paper in the journal Eugenics Review titled "Some Hopes of a Eugenicist," in which he laments how the wealthier, more intelligent, and more beautiful people of the world were being outbred by the poorer stocks of humans. He makes many of the same arguments as Francis Galton and Carl Pearson had before him, that intelligence, morality, beauty, wisdom were biological traits, not arbitrary cultural designations as we now know them to be, and since they were Mendelian traits, they could be acted upon by natural selection. He saw, as did all the eugenicists, that the Aryan stock was more evolved than other peoples, and that natural selection would favor them over all others in the struggle for existence. In 1918, then 28-year-old Fisher published a paper titled "The Correlation Between Relatives on the Supposition of Mendelian inheritance. Apart from being the first time the statistical term variance had ever been used, it sort of represents the beginning of what would become known as neo-Darwinism. In it, Fisher demonstrates mathematically that continuous phenotypic variation could be readily connected to particular Mendelian genes. This paper marked the beginning of how Fisher would think about evolution for the rest of his life. He focused on continuous traits that were the result of many genes of very small effect. He saw natural selection as shaping the variance of each of these genes, as well as their many modifiers, what we now think of as promoters, enhancers, or silencers. Hence, he viewed natural selection as gradual and slow, much like Darwin had. Fisher also thought most natural populations were very large, and so the chance fluctuation of allele frequencies, what we call genetic drift, could be ignored. He accepted a position at the Rothamsted Experimental Station in 1919, and it was his 14 years here that would prove to be the most influential for his development of many statistical methods we still use today. The experimental station studied a variety of agricultural crops and had amassed an incredible amount of data that Fisher was excited to sink his teeth into. He published a series of reports on crop variation over those 14 years at the Rothamsted, where he introduced the concept of the analysis of variance, abbreviated ANOVA, maximum likelihood estimation, permutation tests, and others. In 1930, Fisher published the Genetical Theory of Natural Selection, one of the most important works of the modern synthesis. In it, Fisher described the previous decade's work in theoretical population genetics that had led to a mathematical understanding of how Darwinian natural selection could act upon Mendelian traits. He also put forward his famous fundamental theorem of natural selection, which he showed under a series of questionable assumptions that the rate of increase of the mean fitness of a population that was directly attributable to genetic changes equaled the additive genetic variance. A simple way of thinking about this is that if at any point in time there exists genetic variation that is contributing to the fitness of an organism, then that amount of variation will predict how quickly the fitness of a population can increase, because it's this variation that natural selection acts upon. Fisher also included a chapter on sexual selection, in which he introduced the idea of runaway selection, in which a trait that is considered attractive becomes linked with the trait for the preference for that trait. When this happens, the trait itself becomes increasingly more exaggerated, as its fitness is solely determined by the preference for it. This is how Fisher explained seemingly ridiculous phenotypes, like the peacock's tail. He also put forward a theory for the evolution of mimicry, as well as described his theory for the evolution of dominance. He believed genetic dominance was the result of selection acting on modifiers. Today, we tend to understand dominance as the result of dosage, which was something that Haldane would argue for later. Now, the last 5 chapters of Fisher's book are devoted to eugenics, including reiterating Fisher's 1914 concerns that the upper classes weren't having enough children. The irony in Fisher's eugenics is that he was so sure that intelligence and beauty were beneficial traits that natural selection would favor, and yet the upper class that he believed possessed these traits consistently had less children. If he was being an honest Darwinian, he should have come to the conclusion that being in the upper class was actually an evolutionary disadvantage. Of course, this would have seemed to him absurd. There must be other factors, social and environmental factors, that explain why the upper class weren't reproducing. He went into these in great detail, and yet his politics forbid him from seeing that the same argument is true of the lower classes. The social conditions in which they were exposed placed them there, not their genetics. Nothing about the biology dictated their social position. It was the society in which they were trapped that dictated it. Some population geneticists of the old guard have attempted to defend Fisher against recent allegations that he was a racist, allegations that have led many agencies to rename awards, buildings, and put out statements explicitly condemning him. To confirm his racism, we need look no further than his letter to fellow eugenicist Reginald Gates in 1954, in which he wrote, quote, I am sorry that there should be propaganda in favor of miscegenation in North America, as I am sure it can do nothing but bring harm. Is it beyond human endeavor to give and justly administer equal rights to all citizens without fooling ourselves that these are equivalent items? In case you aren't familiar with what miscegenation means, it refers to interracial relationships. We could also turn to his support of the Nazi eugenicist Ottmar von Verscher, who wrote to Fisher after World War II in 1947 to request he testify to Verscher's character. Verscher was hoping that he could reestablish himself as a human geneticist at the University of Frankfurt after the fall of Nazi Germany. Fisher did, writing to the dean of the medical faculty, quote, "As he has been attacked for sympathy towards the Nazi movement, I may see that his reputation stood exceedingly high among human geneticists before we had heard of Adolf Hitler. It was, I think, his misfortune rather than his fault that racial theory was part of the Nazi ideology, and that it was therefore of some propaganda importance to the Nazi movement to show that the party supported work of unquestioned value such as that of von Verscher. In spite of their prejudices, I have no doubt also that the party sincerely wished to benefit the German racial stock, especially by the elimination of manifest defectives, such as those deficient mentally, and I do not doubt that von Verscher gave, as I should have done, his support to such a movement." In case you're unaware, von Verscher was an advocate of compulsory sterilization, and his student Josef Mengele conducted experiments on children at Auschwitz. Verscher corresponded with Mengele during his time and was almost certainly aware of what was being done, as Mengele sent him numerous blood samples from his own experiments. Verscher would go on to be one of the founders of the Mankind Quarterly, a journal still published to this day that supports scientific racism. In the last decade of Fisher's life, he devoted himself to the cause of publicly denying that tobacco caused cancer. And who else to turn to when you need to twist medical results than an ex-Nazi? Verscher provided Fisher with ample data from his twin studies to support his cause for the tobacco industry. Fisher died in 1962 due to complications from surgery for colon cancer. While Fisher was deriving much of modern statistics and publishing his views on eugenics and Mendelism, John Burden Sanderson Haldane, better known as Jack or just J.B.S., was serving under the 3rd Battalion of the Black Watch in France during the First World War. He joined in 1914, shortly after he, A.D. Sprunt, and his sister Naomi had finished a breeding experiment with mice in which they discovered the first case of genetic linkage in mammals. Haldane wrote the paper while in the trenches, which later led him to remark that he was the, quote, "only officer to complete a scientific paper from a forward position of the Black Watch." Sprunt, his co-author, was killed in battle in March of 1915, which led Haldane to note in the publication that, quote, "owing to the war, it was necessary to publish prematurely, as unfortunately, one of us has already been killed in France." Perhaps Haldane's view of war and his time in the trenches will tell us a bit about him as a person. He was a trench mortar officer, which meant that he was the head of a group that would toss grenades into enemy trenches. In 1932, he remarked on how he enjoyed the opportunity of killing people, and he saw it as one of the great actions of primitive man. His commander, Douglas Haig, referred to Haldane as the, quote, "bravest and dirtiest officer in my army." He was severely injured by a bomb in Iraq in 1916 and spent the remainder of the war in India away from the front, and in 1919 returned to England, taking a position as a fellow at New College, Oxford. In 1922, Haldane met with the mathematician Henry Norton, who was at Trinity College in Cambridge at the time. In 1915, Norton had put together a table for Reginald Punnett for his book Mimicry in Butterflies, which predicted the rates of fixation for an allele acted upon by selection given its initial frequency in the population. At the time, Norton's table was the only quantitative attempt at understanding selection with respect to Mendelian inheritance. In 1924, several major events happened in Haldane's life. First, he began a series of papers titled A Mathematical Theory of Natural and Artificial Selection. In the first lines of the paper, he laid out his goals as, quote, a satisfactory theory of natural selection must be quantitative. In order to establish the view that natural selection is capable of accounting for the known facts of evolution, we must show not only that it can cause a species to change, but that it can cause it to change at a rate which will account for present and past transmutations. In this paper, he derived expressions for predicting evolutionary change under a series of simplifying assumptions, including infinite population size, random mating, complete dominance, etc. Over the 9 papers he would publish in the series, he would subsequently relax each of these assumptions. It was also in these series of papers that he dealt with selection for melanism in the famous peppered moth, becoming the first person to estimate the strength of selection in a natural system. Haldane's focus was largely on the effects of single genes, unlike Fisher, who focused on polygenic traits. However, much like Fisher, Haldane thought in terms of very large populations in which genetic drift could typically be ignored. That same year, he also wrote the little book Daedalus, or Science and the Future. The book, which is really just a long-form essay, was read to the Heretic Society. Haldane employs the Daedalus of Greek myth to embody the scientist, who is a kind of revolutionary force. He writes, quote, the chemical or physical inventor is always a Prometheus. There is no great invention, from fire to flying, which has not been hailed as an insult to some god. Haldane also doubted how much human benefit could be obtained from science, and indeed how it could bring a great deal of human suffering if scientific advance was not coupled with ethics. He also envisioned a future in which humans directed their own evolution, an idea that would inspire Aldous Huxley to write A Brave New World. Perhaps one of the best lines of the essay, and one that resonates with me personally, is his description of a man in the laboratory as, quote, just a poor, little scrubby, underpaid man, groping blindly amid the mazes of the ultramicroscope, conscious of his ghastly mission and proud of it. A journalist from the Daily Express, Charlotte Franken, interviewed Haldane about the book. Charlotte was the daughter of Jewish immigrants, and she described herself as a feminist by the age of 16. She would go on to write several novels, including one called Man's World, a dystopian work in which male scientists ruled the world and restricted how many women were allowed to be born. Her book would be viewed in a similar light as Huxley's Brave New World at the time. Charlotte was married when she met Haldane, but they began having an affair shortly after this interview. She filed for divorce from her husband, and in order to be granted the divorce, as getting a divorce was much more restrictive in the 1920s than it is today, Haldane openly committed adultery with her. At the time, Cambridge had a strange morality police called the Sexvery, which condemned Haldane's gross immorality and dismissed him from the university in 1925. Haldane took to calling them the sex-weary, and with the support of the Cambridge staff that included the philosopher Bertrand Russell, would be reestablished in 1926. Haldane would later be interviewed for the Department magazine. In this interview, he was asked, "When are you at your best?" To which he responded, "My optimum pH is obtained by saturating a 25% aqueous solution of ethanol with CO2. He's talking about when he's drinking alcohol, in case you didn't catch that. And when asked, "When are you at your worst?" he replied, "There is no evidence that the depths of my potential iniquity have been plumbed." The evidence for this would come later, after he divorced Charlotte Franklin in 1945, in which he would then marry Helen Spurway, who was his former PhD student, later that year. Haldane, like his father before him, was also well known as using himself as a guinea pig in his studies on physiology. This included drinking hydrochloric acid to examine its effects of acidification on his blood. In another, he studied elevated oxygen saturation, which sent him into a seizure and caused him to crush his own vertebrae. Another, he locked himself in a decompression chamber, which blew a hole in his eardrum. He would later remark on this in the book What is Life, stating, quote, The drum generally heals up, and if a hole remains in it, although one is somewhat deaf, one can blow tobacco smoke out of the ear in question, which is a social accomplishment. Like Fisher, Haldane believed in eugenics. He stated as much in Daedalus, but his views were a bit different than Fisher's. In his essay, Eugenics and Social Reform, he wrote, quote, "If you desire to check the increase of any population or section of the population, either massacre it or force upon it the greatest practical amount of liberty, education, and wealth. Civilization stands in real danger of overproduction of under men. But if it perishes from this cause, it will be because its governing class cared more for the wealth than for justice." In this, Haldane reveals his socialism, and as he lays the blame at the feet of the governing class. Now, it's impossible to understand the various controversies that Haldane would later find himself in without speaking of his devotion to socialism and Marxism. He wrote that he became a socialist during the First World War, and this would lead him to be a frequent contributor to the Marxist magazine Daily Worker. He went so far as to state, quote, "I think that Marxism is true," and wrote in 1945 the article titled "Why Professional Workers Should Be Communists." Haldane joined the Communist Party in Great Britain in 1937, and he supported the Spanish Republic during the Spanish Civil War. The story of Haldane during the Spanish Civil War is iconic and honestly pretty hilarious. He was in his 40s by this point and a large man, but was a famous scientist and was described by the commander, Fred Copeman, as a valuable asset for the cause. So Copeman was instructed to keep him around because it was, a good visual, but don't get him killed, which Copeman struggled with as everywhere he looked, Haldane was getting himself into trouble. One incident, Haldane, while having lunch at the Grand Via, told the journalist Virginia Cowles, quote, "Think I'll hop down to the battlefield and have a look around. You want to come?" He led the journalists into the trenches where they felt bullets soaring over their heads, but Haldane assured her they were only little ones, and so she shouldn't worry. He later met the writer Ernest Hemingway and journalist Martha Gellhorn in Spain as well. The three of them, along with the journalist Virginia Cowles, set up in a blown-out house to watch one particular battle. Haldane apparently sat in the middle of the room to get a full view, adjusting his field glasses to take in the whole scene. Hemingway told Haldane that he'd be seen, that his field glasses were reflecting the sun. Haldane said, "My dear fellow, I can assure you there isn't any danger here in this house." Within minutes, the house was shelled. Cowles, Hemingway, and Gellhorn dove for cover while Haldane fled, and they found him later in a hotel bar. On a more somber note, he told Julia Bell, a geneticist and collaborator of his, that he was sitting on a park bench next to an old woman during one of the air raids in Spain, and that shrapnel from a bomb struck and killed her. He was shook by the incident and would write later, quote, "Air raids are not only wrong, they are loathsome and disgusting. If you have ever seen a child smashed by a bomb into something like a mixture of dirty rags and cat's meat, you would realize this fact as intensely as I do." Haldane's communism and vocal support for the Soviet Union would eventuate a clash between himself and the Communist Party over the Soviet Union's support of Lysenko. In case you're unaware, Lysenkoism was the official state policy in the Soviet Union, promoted by the Russian ideologue Lysenko, and he stated that Mendelian genetics and natural selection were false capitalist propaganda, relying instead on the perspective that nature itself was Marxist and would support the Marxist cause. Lysenko believed that he could transform species by exposing them to extreme conditions, a kind of Lamarckian evolution. He also believed that crops wouldn't compete for space. Remember, competition is a capitalist notion, and so farmers didn't need to be concerned with spacing out their crops. Once Lysenkoism was adopted as state policy, geneticists in Russia were imprisoned and executed. Haldane was reluctant to criticize the Soviet Union. He was repeatedly pressed to comment on Lysenko, but refused for several years to openly condemn it. As with R.A. Fisher previously mentioned, his politics stood in the way of his science. He knew Lysenko was wrong. He was a world-renowned expert in Mendelian genetics and Darwinian selection by 1940, and yet he wrote that the dispute between the geneticists in the Soviet Union and the Lysenkoists was done, quote, not with venom, but in a friendly spirit. This is patently false, and there's good reason to believe that Haldane knew it. He would eventually come around to openly condemning Lysenko, and the entire affair would lead him to resigning from the Communist Party in 1950. Haldane's scientific achievements are as extensive as Fisher's. In 1931, a year after Fisher's Genetical Theory of Natural Selection, Haldane published his own book on the topic, titled The Causes of Evolution, which was actually a collection of lectures he'd given on the topic in preceding years. Haldane was the first person to derive the human mutation rate, and even made famous the idea of primordial soup in his writings on the origins of life. He likened early Earth to a vast chemical laboratory that was a mixture of organic and inorganic compounds, like a hot dilute soup. He proposed how the chemicals at the time, thought to be in abundance on early Earth, could have self-assembled into the earliest living or half-living things. In his essay on Being the Right Size, published in 1926, he proposed a compelling hypothesis for why organisms differ in their body size based on their ability to transport oxygen around the body. He also contributed to the concept of genetic load, the evolution of dominance, and the so-called cost of natural selection. In 1956, Haldane left the University College London and moved to India, rebuking his British citizenship in protest of the UK's invasion of Egypt during the Suez Crisis. He wrote, quote, "Finally, I am going to India because I consider that recent acts of the British government have been violations of international law." On a lighter note, he also added to his reasons for moving to India his love for Indian food over British, and the fact that he no longer wanted to wear socks. He wrote, quote, 60 years in socks is enough. He adopted traditional Indian attire thereafter and was never again seen in socks. He leaned into Indian culture in his time there, becoming a citizen and even became a vegetarian. When in 1961 Haldane remarked that India was the, quote, closest approximation of the free world, the mathematician Jerzy Newman objected that India had its own share of scoundrels and, quote, disgustingly subservient individuals who are not attractive. Haldane, in his ever-biting wit, responded, quote, perhaps one is freer to be a scoundrel in India than elsewhere. The disgusting subservience of others has its limits. The people of Calcutta riot, upset trams, and refuse to obey police regulations in a manner that would have delighted Thomas Jefferson. He would in the following year describe as one of his chief duties as a citizen is to be a nuisance of the government of his state. Despite this, he praised India for its great diversity and saw it as the best model for a possible world organization. Haldane was diagnosed with colorectal cancer in 1963. His graduate student and dear friend John Maynard Smith, an incredibly important evolutionary thinker in his own right, has told the story of Haldane's surgery in 1964. He said that Haldane was very particular about having good last words, and prior to the surgery, he told Maynard Smith, quote, well, Smith, I've just had me last shit. When Maynard Smith pressed him to explain, he wouldn't, because he wanted those to be his last words. Haldane survived the surgery, but he would die later that year. Before his death, he wrote a poem that was published in New Statesman titled Cancer's a Funny Thing. It goes, I wish I had the voice of Homer to sing of rectal carcinoma, that kills a lot more chaps, in fact, than were bumped off when Troy was sacked. I know that cancer often kills, but so do cars and sleeping pills. And it can hurt one till one sweats, so can bad teeth and unpaid debts. A spot of laughter, I am sure, often accelerates one's cure. So let us patients do our bit to help the surgeons make us fit. While Fisher and Haldane focused most of their lives on the paramount importance of natural selection, often assuming very large or infinite populations, Sewall Wright marks a dramatic departure. And while Fisher focused on polygenic traits that natural selection acted upon, and Haldane on the importance of single gene impacts, Wright tended to view the entire genome as a complex network of genetic interactions, and natural selection as acting on the emergent properties of this network. While Fisher and Haldane were both Englishmen, Wright descended from a long line of American reverends and judges, economists, and writers. His two younger brothers would also become renowned in their own fields, one an aeronautical engineer and the other a political scientist. Wright was gifted in mathematics from a young age and enjoyed applying mathematical thinking to all sorts of mundane issues. Interestingly, while Haldane was a fervent agnostic and skeptic, both Wright and Fisher were religious men. Fisher in a more traditional, conservative Christian perspective, while Wright was a Unitarian. Quite unlike Haldane and Fisher, Wright did not venture into politics and made very few ventures into the public realm. However, he did have a very lively dispute with Fisher for the second half of his career, and despite being known as a very gentle man, he managed to muster considerable ire for Ronald Fisher. Wright went to Lombard College for his undergraduate degree and there met Professor Wilhelmine Key, one of the first female biologists to receive a PhD. She fostered in Wright a great curiosity for the natural world, and under her recommendation, he was accepted into a PhD program at Harvard working with William Castle. Castle, you'll recall, was instrumental in his widespread acceptance of Darwinian selection on continuous traits with his hooded rat experiments. Wright would aid in these experiments during his time at Harvard, as well as develop his own research system, the guinea pig. These little furry critters would be his main study organism for the rest of his life. There are so many pictures of this man holding guinea pigs, it's actually adorable. In 1920, Wright published a paper titled The Relative Importance of Heredity and Environment in Determining the Piebald Pattern of Guinea Pigs. In it, he displayed a remarkably modern understanding of inheritance. In one figure, he draws out guinea pigs and diagrams their paths of relatedness that included ontogenetic, that is, developmental, impacts, as well as environmental ones. Furthermore, he makes direct reference to the chance inheritance of sperm and egg from each parent that are themselves drawn from a set of possible combinations. This line of thinking foreshadows one of Wright's greatest accomplishments, the path coefficient. This is a statistical technique that takes a graphical approach to estimating some value given the number of connected paths between the value and some other quantity of interest. In Wright's case, he was often interested in measuring how likely it was that two individuals share a gene in common due to ancestry. Well, this probability can be estimated straightforwardly if you know how they are connected through a pedigree, and you need merely count the number of connecting paths between them and then multiply that number by the Mendelian proportion of 50%. He formalized his path coefficient theory in 1921 in his Systems of Mating series of papers, and also in 1922 with his work in the American Naturalist on the coefficients of inbreeding. This background in animal breeding and thinking in terms of pedigrees and inbreeding would have a major impact on how he viewed evolution. He departed sharply from Fisher and Haldane's focus on infinite populations. He saw these as unreasonable, that real populations were much smaller, that individuals didn't mate randomly because they might live on a large landscape and might not encounter one another in a single lifespan. Instead, individuals mate more often with those who they're near, and if this pattern holds true, then individuals are more likely to mate with close relatives. Wright was interested in how these systems of mating shaped allele frequency dynamics in populations, and especially how factors of inbreeding interacted with natural selection. One of his major contributions to evolutionary theory came in 1931 with the paper Evolution in Mendelian Populations. It was a beast of a manuscript at 63 pages, but it was an excellent summary of our understanding of Darwinian selection and Mendelian inheritance at the time, including the concept of mutation selection equilibrium, migration selection equilibrium, concepts of multiple alleles, random gene fluctuations, what we now call genetic drift, the rate at which heterozygosity decreases in a population under drift alone, and the influence of population size on this change. It is also in this paper that he first hints at what would become his broader theory of evolution via shifting adaptive landscapes, called the shifting balance theory. He notes at the end of the paper that evolution in very large populations will be slow and inefficient at rapidly changing in response to the environment. However, he envisioned the case in which large populations were actually subdivided, with some number of migrants shared between these subpopulations each generation. In this way, subpopulations could fix an allele much faster and over time could spread via migration to the rest of the range. A very important concept emerges from Wright's thinking here. He is recognizing the role of random drift. By focusing on the fact that populations are finite and rarely randomly mating, he supposed that chance fluctuations in frequencies would have a large role to play in evolution. It's not that he was a neutralist in the Kimura sense, that was another 40 years away, but he did think that drift couldn't be ignored. This paper also marks the beginning of the hostility between Fisher and Wright. Wright had sent Fisher his paper a few years prior for a friendly review while he was still working on it, which Fisher provided. However, Wright was angered to find that some of his results appeared in Fisher's 1930 book, published before Wright managed to complete his 31 manuscript. Wright felt that Fisher had stolen his ideas, and after this incident, Wright never again sent a paper to his colleagues to review. Wright would spend his career insisting that the influence of population structure couldn't be ignored in evolution. He wrote dozens of papers throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s, developing theoretical models of populations that allowed discrete as well as continuous patterns of ancestry. He developed the famous F statistics, which allowed researchers to measure the degree of genetic differentiation between subpopulations, among which were also inbreeding coefficients that measured the rate of genetic drift within populations. His most controversial idea was the shifting balance theory of evolution alluded to earlier. If we imagine a landscape of fitness with peaks of high fitness and valleys of low, then a population inevitably, via natural selection, reaches the peak of fitness. However, since the environment is always changing, the peaks elsewhere will rise and fall, and it might benefit a population to explore alternative peaks of fitness. However, selection doesn't permit this. Any decrease in fitness is always selected against. For Wright, this is where genetic drift comes in. If a subpopulation is very small, occupying one such peak, genetic drift might permit genotypes to cross valleys of low fitness since their frequency change is chance-based. In doing so, if they happen upon a new peak, selection can resume and lift the population. In this way, subdivided populations can explore an adaptive landscape. Wright's insistence on the role of genetic drift brought fierce disagreement from his colleagues, especially Fisher and the empiricist E.B. Ford. They had examined allele frequency fluctuations in a population of Panaxia moths and concluded that overdominance, the phenomenon in which heterozygotes have higher fitness than the homozygotes, explained their observations. Wright retorted that a small effective population size could also be an explanation, and that additional data were necessary before concluding that selection was the prime driver. At several points, it seemed that both Fisher and Wright were misunderstanding one another. Fisher wrote a rebuttal to Wright's idea of the shifting balance theory by arguing that chance fluctuations occurred in panmictic populations as well. But nowhere does Wright state that drift doesn't also apply in large populations. He even derives expectations for allele frequency fluctuations in different population sizes in his prior response to Fisher and Ford. Wright, similarly, seems to suggest that Fisher rejected chance fluctuations at all, something he clearly didn't. At the heart of their disagreement was actually a matter of degree and emphasis. Wright emphasized the need for a holistic view of evolution that accounted for all the forces at hand, while Fisher thought natural selection was the most important, and others were relevant only in very niche situations. Fisher's school of thinking actually won the debate in the marketplace of ideas, even if it wasn't strictly correct, as Moto Kimura would later show in 1968. For most of the development of the modern synthesis that would follow, random genetic fluctuation was ignored, with Ernst Mayr completely dismissing the idea as unimportant in evolution. When Stephen Jay Gould spoke with Wright years later concerning the development of the modern synthesis, Wright told him he had felt totally left out of it. But that's a story for another day. Each of these men are responsible in their own rights for the unification of Darwinian natural selection and Mendelian inheritance. Let's take a moment and review each of their important contributions specifically to this end. R.A. Fisher showed us that Mendelian inheritance could account for continuous traits in which many genes of small effect each contribute to the trait, and that natural selection could act upon these traits. He also showed that selection can shape modifiers, in modern parlance promoters and enhancers, and change the expression of traits. J.B.S. Haldane derived the first broad mathematical expressions of natural selection acting on single genes inherited in Mendelian fashion, including how it behaved different under different systems of dominance. Lastly, Sewall Wright focused on the genome as a complex network of interactions, and how natural selection is limited by the power of random genetic drift. He provided us with an array of complex population models from which we can make predictions about how selection and drift should shape gene frequencies given different systems of mating and dispersal. As mentioned in each of their biogeographic sections, they contributed much more than just these, and were each interesting characters who lived fascinating, if not at times deeply troubling lives. Hopefully, you now have a good understanding of these three men and how they each played important roles in the early development of evolutionary theory, and ultimately, how they became evolution's great Trinity. Thanks for being here. Hit that like and subscribe button, and if you have any questions, drop them in the comment. And if you're particularly interested in the Mendelian versus biometrician debate, let me know and I might do a follow-up to kind of go through the history of that. Again, thanks for being here, and I'll catch you next time.